Bom dia, gente. Boa tarde, boa noite. Meu nome é João Pedro, eu sou pesquisador do Gepal, Grupo de Estudos de Política da América Latina. Eu estou aqui com a Lara, também pesquisadora do grupo. E hoje a gente vai entrevistar o Asad Haider. Ele é escritor do livro Armadilha da Identidade, publicado pela editora Veneta no ano passado. Ele também é editor do site Viewpoint Magazine, um site bastante interessante, com vários textos sobre teoria marxista. Bom, e hoje a gente vai falar com ele sobre diversos temas, sobre teoria marxista e coisas do tipo. Assim. So, hello, Asad, how are you?
I'm all right. How about you?
I'm all right, thanks. Asad, before we start, let me just say something. When I was doing a little research to interview you, I saw a lot of another interviews from you, and I realized that when people see you, people see only race. You know, people only talk to you about race. Yeah. And you are much more than that, you know. You write text about Althusser, about Gramsci, about Stewart Hall, but people only talk about race.
Yes.
Why is that? What?
You know, it's a very consistent pattern. It's true, and I think there are a few different reasons for it. I mean, one reason we could say in a fairly neutral way is just how central a political issue it is now in the United States, certainly in Brazil as well. So people want to hear about it. They want to hear perspectives that appear to be different from what you get in the mainstream. And, you know, my book was, it caused some controversy, so I think people are interested in that. Then on the other hand, you know, if you are a person of color who talks about race, that's what people think, you know, that's your job for the rest of your life. And so that is an unfortunate aspect of this, which is really, you get, it's part of what I talk about, you know, and criticize, is the reduction to identity. The entire reduction of ideas, political discussions, theoretical discussions to identity.
Well, that's pretty much something that we're trying to avoid here today, because we're going to try to explore your knowledge beyond race. But first, we cannot start this interview without talking about the protests, the recent protests in the United States. And mainly, we actually wanted to know your perception of it, because here in Brazil, we have a narrative that it was this united front of free individuals against racism, that were saying that Black Lives Matter, and that's pretty much it. So what were the social forces? What was behind it? What were the demands? What was actually happening there?
That's an interesting question, because there's no single way to characterize it. In different cities, it was totally different. At different times, it was totally different. And it contained many different social elements, which advanced many different kinds of politics. And the scale, of course, was enormous. And I think that an important part of it was not just the police violence and the background of anti-racist protests, but also the situation of the pandemic, in which people had been, you know, indoors for all this time. People were in difficult economic situations. And so it was a sudden explosion that people were out on the streets. And of course, inevitably, there are things like looting and so on that happen in times of economic distress. Yeah, so it's complicated to characterize, and something that was of that scale and intensity, it can't be sustained in that form for too long. So it certainly has declined and changed in various ways. I don't know yet what organized forces will come out of it. Certainly, many different organizations were involved in generating it, but there was no particular leadership, or there was no particular kind of organization that you could say really represented it. Yeah.
And Asad, in your opinion, what's the role of Black Lives Matter movement? You know, because we have really different narratives here in Brazil. Some people say that it is a, I don't know, important movement, but some people say that it's too much close with the Democratic Party. I don't know, what's your opinion about it?
It depends on what you mean when you talk about Black Lives Matter. There's an organization called Black Lives Matter, which is, you know, a very top-down reformist kind of organization. You know, there are many people who participate in the movement who have this liberal Democratic Party kind of politics. There are many people who may be participating in politics for the first time. There may be people who came out of previous social movements, Occupy movement, Bernie Sanders campaign, and so on. So you can't sum it up with one kind of politics, but it's very contradictory. And of course, there is a very strong attempt by the Democratic Party to absorb it. And to, as I say in my book, to neutralize any oppositional character it might have. And turn it into an entirely representational issue, rather than something which is about challenging the state apparatuses.
Yeah. Asad, you just said about neutralize. In your last article that you wrote about factionalism, about dismissal, yeah, you said a lot about factionalism, about how it kind of neutralized the struggle. Can you talk a little about it?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's something that I discuss in my book. Experiences that I've had, and anyone who has participated in politics knows that factionalism is always waiting around the corner. There are almost always these moments in which the political content of the group or the political aims of the group become overshadowed by some kind of opposition internal to the group, which may often have to do with personal disputes or arbitrary divisions of friends and enemies that are not related to the initial organizing impulse, to the character of the politics. And so in this article, Dismissal, I looked at one case, the case of factionalism in the Chinese Cultural Revolution, which had gotten me to think a lot about the question of factionalism. I mean, it's an unusual example, but it was through reading some of these studies that I began to think through this problem. Why is it that in organizations and movements which are supposed to be about liberation and emancipation, we see the emergence of factional divisions, conformism, people attacking each other, repressing each other? Why does that happen? And it's a great problem throughout the whole history of the left, and it's one that we have to confront.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting that you use, you know, the Cultural Revolution as a case study, you know. So what's the importance of studying the experience of state socialism, or really existing socialism, you know, whatever, but
yeah,
that's it.
Yeah, I think that we have to reconcile ourselves to the fact that the great revolutions of the 20th century took place where they did, in the way they did, and had the results that they did. We can't look back and say it would have been better if it happened here, it would have been better if someone else was in charge, and so on. We have to understand, and I also think we can't just say, well, that wasn't really socialism or whatever. I mean, it may be true. I wouldn't characterize, certainly I wouldn't characterize the societies that came out of these revolutions as communist. I also think that to call them capitalist is just a kind of moral thing. It's because capitalism is bad and you think that these societies weren't truly communist, you call them capitalist. But in societies in which they've abolished private property, they've abolished the labor market, I don't think it's very meaningful to continue to describe them as capitalist. So there's something else which was not the achievement of communism, but it was I think we can understand them as genuine attempts to engage in a transition to a different kind of society, which ultimately failed. And so we have to think through those problems that people faced after revolutions. How, after you have overcome the existing regime, how do you go about creating a different society? How do you go about creating different institutions? These are not simple questions. And so we have to, I think, study these attempts. We have to study the failures and the successes as well. And we also have to understand that the fact that this happened and we now exist in a world after that means that we have to think about what kind of politics can come after that historical sequence. We have to think of a new kind of way of doing politics, because revolutions on that model are not going to happen again. They happened in a different world. They happened in our world, but they happened in a different set of historical conditions and circumstances. So we have a different situation. And so just as those revolutions responded to their situations, our political activity has to respond to our situation. And so I think studying the historical revolutions and the attempts at socialist construction which followed are very important in being able to start to conceive of a new mode of politics for today.
And when you make that analysis and you talk about understanding all of those movements at their time, right? We also, when we study these movements, both me and João study about the Black Panthers. Also, what could we learn, not only in their, how can I say, their strong suit, but also their weaknesses or what they were incapable of fighting against? For an example, you talk about the neutralizing of the identity politics, which in the 70s, when you're studying the movements, it's almost like a invisible smoke magically passed through and ended everything. So how could we study these movements and try to do a constructive criticism to try to understand the tactical strategies we could use today or that weren't used before? What could we learn from them?
Yeah. So one thing I will say is that this angle about race and identity and neutralization, this is an important one with the example of the Black Panthers. But then also, we can understand an organization like the Black Panther Party as one of the many international left organizations, which we don't have to compare them to other Black groups in the U.S. Exclusively. We can compare them, to extra parliamentary groups in Italy in the 70s. We can compare them in Japan, and so these movements also faced factionalism. This was an international phenomenon, and the Black Panthers certainly faced factionalism. They faced a situation in which their existing strategic and organizational practices came up against limits. Of course, there was severe state repression, and that happened all over the world. And that is a very important factor. But there is also an internal problem, which is that in any movement, you will ultimately arrive at limits of particular practices, and they have to change in some way. One thing that you saw happen in the 70s, especially in the late 70s, is that as the sequences that had started began to come to an end, as these existing modes of politics entered into a crisis, there was an attempt to force the persistence of that model. And often this was through the authoritarian consolidation of the group. It could have been through violence, a turn to armed struggle. The turns to armed struggle that happened in the late 70s happened precisely in circumstances in which the movement had been constricted and was shrinking and was no longer as powerful. Was in less of a situation to launch an armed struggle than it had been a decade before. And so this is an interesting phenomenon to consider and important to study. Then there's, related to this, I use the word neutralization. I've been using three terms. Neutralization I used in the book, and then since then I've thought in terms of depoliticization and exhaustion. And these are important terms for me as well, and there's a relationship between them. Neutralization is, in the way that is presented in Mistaken Identity, is when an oppositional force is countered from the top by some kind of reaction which reduces the opposition and turns that element into a harmonious part of the system. It resolves that antagonism. Depoliticization is a twofold thing. And, for one thing, neutralization results in a depoliticization. That is, it results in the fact that the proposal of a different kind of politics disappears. And then there's also the general historical condition of depoliticization, which is the one I was describing earlier, which is the one that results from the fact that the great socialist experiments came to an end, that they failed, and that now we don't know what the new mode of politics is. So we have a historical condition of depoliticization, and then we have, at the level of specific movements and specific political practices, a moment of depoliticization. And then I use the term exhaustion to say, what I was describing earlier, the point at which the existing practices and strategies and organizational forms of a movement no longer apply to the situation. Their possibilities have been exhausted, or you could also say saturated. And so this is this doesn't mean that they were doomed to failure from the beginning, that they were mistakes, that there was something wrong with them from the outset. It means that they came up against a limit, they were exhausted. And so that exhaustion is another factor in depoliticization. So you could say neutralization comes from the top, exhaustion is a result of the process. Both result in depoliticization. And so I think this is one of the major problems that every movement has to face now, and that we can study how these limits were encountered in the past and try to think about how to respond to depoliticization when we encounter it in such a way that we are able to revive politics, to make politics possible again.
Asad, you, in your book and your articles, you talk a lot about Stewart Hall, early Stewart Hall, like Policing the Crisis and so on. And he talks about a lot about the role of the right wing in imposes this conjuncture, So how do you view that? How's the active role of the right wing movements, neoliberalism, to impose us this conjuncture of exhaustion and depolitization and so on?
Yeah, so, Stewart Hall, I think of the ideas Stewart Hall is forming in this period, they have to do with what he calls, drawing on Gramsci and so on, the crisis of hegemony, which is partly a result of the social movements of the 60s and 70s, the way that they challenge not only political but also cultural authority, and the the sense in which the existing norms and structures of the society had been challenged in a fundamental way. And this came along with an economic crisis, which marked the end of this period, the post-war period, which has been characterized in many ways. We could say Fordist, we could use other terms, but it was the crisis of this particular organization of capitalist society. And it was a political crisis in which the existing political parties, in the Labour Party, for example, which was supposed to be a representative of the working class, had to manage a capitalist economy in crisis and become a force of discipline and containment for the working class. So this is a political crisis. And in this overall situation, Hall identified a new strategy of the right, because Poulantzas had talked about authoritarian statism. So when you still have the structures of bourgeois democracy, but the introduction of authoritarian practices and so on. And so, of course, Hall's modification is to talk about authoritarian populism, to talk about how this kind of statism, this authoritarianism is introduced through the construction of a particular kind of people, a national and collective subject of the people, which is produced by this right-wing strategy. And so this is, the importance of this theory, I think, is that it shows that the transformations of the capitalist economy, the introduction of neoliberalism and so on, and the political changes of the state are not just part of a kind of, they're not just part of patterns of historical development that always unfold in the same way, but they are the result of specific strategies, contingent circumstances in which different actors are able to achieve different things. And so this was, what Thatcher and Reagan accomplished was a major political transformation. It was not preordained. This way of managing the crisis was a strategy which has to be met with another strategy. It has, you can't just repeat formulas or say that in the end the forces of history will prevail. You have to come up with a strategy that can actually defeat this very powerful strategy.
I agree with you. I believe that when left met with this new strategy, we like kind of stuck, we couldn't develop another strategy. And, that's why we are the way we are, I think.
Yeah, and you could say, recently, probably the situations in the US and in Brazil are, there are many differences, but certainly Trump and Bolsonaro have many common features. And I think we didn't have the level of instability in the political system that you did. And obviously we also didn't have the level of opposition that you did. We don't have, there's no social democracy in the US. Bernie Sanders is the closest that we got. And of course, he didn't become president. But we did have a crisis of the political system here, in which the political parties lost control. They lost control in the sense that within the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders began to introduce a kind of politics that went far beyond what was permissible. And then in the Republican Party, Donald Trump a political outsider came in and was able to dominate it. It was able to once again to push the Republican Party beyond its existing practices. It went beyond what the party establishment was comfortable with. And it was a kind of, he had a strategy which was reminiscent of authoritarian populism. It's perhaps new in various ways that will have to be studied. But this is a situation in which he succeeded at a certain level with his strategy, but we're going to find out next week how successful it is, because we don't. There are certainly cracks in this system right now. I mean, I don't know what the outcome will be, but I think his position is not as good as he thought it would be, but it's, at this point, after 2016, it seems like it would be stupid to make a prediction, so.
Yeah, I think in both countries we had like what Marx would call a crisis of representation. The natural parties of the bourgeoisie lost a lot of legitimacy, at least here in Brazil. Yeah, I think here this phenomena is stronger because we had a coup d'etat, so a lot of organic parties of the bourgeoisie lost a lot of legitimacy. So that's why the bourgeoisie needed to invest in the middle class movement of Bolsonaro, that neo-fascist middle class movement. And maybe in the US, the alternative was inside parties, because Trump tried to beat this alternative, to this crisis of representation. And I don't know, maybe Bernie Sanders, but I don't know. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, of course, you're right. We've had nothing comparable to a coup, and I don't think there will be a coup. I don't think there will be, whatever the outcome of the election. I don't think there's going to be a large scale of unrest or violence. I also think that Trump, he doesn't really like being president. He doesn't like losing, but he wants the attention. He wants to be the center of attention. He wants to be some kind of political leader, but I don't think he wants to do all of the things that are involved in the job of being president. So he is in this strange situation now. I think there was a loss of legitimacy of the parties because they're not functioning well. They're not presenting any cohesive. I mean, the Republicans are getting behind Trump, even though they opposed him at first. The Democrats, they failed so miserably in the last election that now they are trying to figure out who to appeal to consolidate their stability. The Bernie Sanders challenge, it went far beyond what I expected in the primaries this time. And so there was something really remarkable about it when you thought that there was a chance that he would win the nomination. That was a very unexpected scenario, and I think very frightening to the party establishment. And so they've used a range of strategies to counteract it. They used identity politics in a very powerful way. And they've stuck with that. And it's a question: who does this identity politics appeal to? It appeals certainly to a certain layer of educated progressive voters. Does it appeal to the broader population? That's not clear. And I don't know. There's certainly there is a lot of progressive change in public opinion in the United States. When people in polls are more and more recognizing that there is a history of racism. There is broad opposition to racism, and so on. But I don't know what definite conclusions can be drawn from that, or what Democratic Party strategy will be successful, who they will be able to appeal to, and who they will be able to constitute as their base going forward.
Yeah, I think we are drawing so much the attention to this whole neutralization and depolitization and exhaustion and everything you're talking about, because while studying the 70s, it feels really current in Brazil, because you have this right offensive, let's say like that, and basically the left is only reacting to it in an automatic sense. So it's almost, it seems like an opposition, but it's actually just a complement in a dialectical way. So identity politics, it's actually a really important conversation that here in Brazil, it's really, it's a thin line that we have to talk about this, because even with your book, I remember we both went to São Paulo when you were there talking about your book, and the people there, when they were asking questions, when they were talking, you could see that they read the book and they couldn't understand what the book was saying, because we're so blind by trusting democracy, a democracy that was so clearly completely shattered some years ago. And there is this impossibility to try to break it. So what do you think also are some strategies to try to break with identity politics? Obviously, it's not a universal thing, but by what you study.
It's, as you said, there are certain commonalities. The way the discourse of identity politics, I can see there are commonalities. There's some commonalities at the level of the history of race, and now we see common features of Bolsonaro and Trump. But as you said, the destruction of democracy that happened in Brazil, we didn't have anything comparable to that in the United States. We can't describe anything, Trump's election as anything like that. And then also we don't have meaningful social democracy in the US. Bernie Sanders may have represented that politics. Many people may have gotten excited by it, but we don't have a mass party with millions of members. And, we have no serious representation at the level of government of that. So in the United States, when we talk about strategies and organizations, we are starting at a very low level. How do we even begin to advance the idea of an anti-capitalist politics of any kind? And as that began, we encountered the conflict with identity politics, and it's been difficult to figure out how to deal with that. I think there was more success this time around. And in your context, it seems that, I don't know, it seems like you need to have some organized force that goes beyond social democracy in order to present a political alternative. Because, I don't know, how is identity politics used in Brazil?
Actually, Brazil imports basically every concept from the United States. So that's why it's so current here. But actually, we had a government that was the closest we ever had to a social democracy, and there was affirmative action, and basically the whole left started to make these demands to the government and understand racism and all of these other oppressions based on those demands to the government through affirmative action. And when you suddenly have a government who does the opposite, who has a discourse that is so completely conservative and racist and fascist and all of that, that logic hasn't changed. So you still are demanding from the state things that clearly the state is not going to give you anymore.
Now, was identity politics used against the Workers' Party?
I don't think so. I don't know. It's like they have actually a bond. A lot of people who defend identity politics is related to the Workers' Party, because Workers' Party did a lot of affirmative politics, so they kind of use identity politics in the practice, And it's really, for me, it's really a case of cultural imperialism, because the concepts are exactly the same from the US. And that's why your book's so important to us, because, the concepts that people use here in Brazil, like white privilege and intersectionality, are actually the same. Of course, not in the revolutionary way that they were developed, but in the way they changed, But, that's why your book's so important, actually, because we use the concepts exactly like in the US.
And it's also, I think, a mirror image. So the Workers' Party is actually identified with identity politics. So everything that is democratic, that is good, that it's anti-racist, anti-sexist, and all of that, it's connected to the people and the Workers' Party, which has been completely defeated.
Yeah, so if you try to propose a politics that is more revolutionary than the Workers' Party, people will respond with identity politics.
Exactly.
Right.
Because either you are with the identity politics and you believe in democracy, or you're fascist.
Right. And fascism is a complicated issue as well, because a lot of people here say, this is part of why the Bernie Sanders campaign failed and why they capitulated, and got behind Biden, because there was this idea that Trump is a uniquely fascist threat, and that everything has to be done just to get rid of him. We can make every compromise, and there can be a complicated historical discussion of what fascism is. Do these things resemble fascism, or do they meet the characteristics of historical fascism? And maybe Bolsonaro does a little bit more than Trump. But that rhetoric and discourse is used to shut down any political movement beyond compromise.
I think we discussed a lot of the conjecture. I think we could go on to some more theoretical Marxist theory vibe to our next questions. If I'm not mistaken, João has one before me.
Yeah, our research group here in Brazil study a lot of Althusser and Polanczas and that stuff. We use them a lot to use conjuncture analysis, so to identify the class fractions and stuff like that. And you use a lot of Althusser in your book. So first, how did you came along with Althusser? That's the first question, I guess.
Okay. I was interested in what they called Western Marxism, When I was young, I thought I was interested in the Frankfurt School, actually, because I thought I wanted to try to understand the advanced capitalist societies and how they are different, how the role of culture and media and things like that. I was very interested in that, so I was trying to study Western Marxism. And then I encountered, I read first Contradiction and Overdetermination, and I didn't understand what was going on at all, but it was certainly clear that there was a very distinct and powerful argument being presented there. And so I had that in the back of my mind. And then later I read, of course, the famous ideology essay, and it appeared to immediately be relevant and of great interest. I didn't know how to distinguish his approach from the Frankfurt School or other theories of ideology at that time. It wasn't clear to me. But it's a very strange piece. It's the thing that most people read by Althusser, but it's very different from the other things that he wrote in style as well. It's in many ways, he's constantly making jokes, I think, in that essay. But then the real breakthrough was when I read in a class on Gramsci, I read his book on Machiavelli. And I was very surprised by this book because, especially in the English language world, there's this idea first that Althusser was a structuralist, and saw everything as history as fixed, and second, that because he had a critique of the subject, that he had no conception of how there could be any political change. And I saw in this book, first of all, a theory of the conjuncture of contingency, which is not compatible with structuralism, and then an attempt to begin to produce a theory of political agency. He doesn't use the word subject, but this is a central theme of the book. And so that showed me a totally different Althusser. And at that point, I became fascinated. And then after exploring some of the later work, I went back to the classic texts, and I still believe, they're harder to understand if you're coming to them without context. But I believe and this is what I've done anytime I have done collective study of Althusser, and say we must start with the classic texts because you have to lay this foundation. And and that convinced me completely to, this was a superior approach to the Frankfurt School and any of these other tendencies. So, yeah.
Yeah, and the fact that you use it in your book, at least at first view, for every Brazilian that probably saw the book, was a shock, because here Althusser also has that appearance of the structuralist that doesn't consider the subject. He never thought about people, and you use it in a book that talks about race. So how could we understand race and think about race and also different oppressions? But because your book's about this, I'm focusing on it through Althusser.
So there are two senses. I mean, first, in the sense of contradiction and overdetermination. I mean, overdetermination is very important to understand here. Now, there would be a kind of mistake, a mistaken reading in my view, which would be a structuralist one of overdetermination, which would be equivalent in some senses to intersectionality. It would say that there are these different social relations or different social structures which exist, and they intersect and combine in different ways to cause things. And so you have to understand the way that they interact. And this is what people are doing now when they talk about race and class or racism and capitalism, or use the term racial capitalism or something like that. They say that, okay, these things are intertwined or intersecting, etc. But Althusser is quite clear in that essay that, you know, the logic of overdetermination goes much beyond that, because you can't conceive of these separately existing structures, self-sufficient, which then interact with each other, but rather you have to understand that, let's say, to use language elsewhere, the cause exists in its effects. That that the logic of overdetermination goes all the way down, and that in any phenomenon. Now, if we turn to the method that he lays out in on the materialist dialectic, in any phenomenon, a social phenomenon that we see, we're not seeing the intersection of already existing structures, but rather we're seeing an uneven, complex whole. And we produce concepts in order to grasp aspects of that whole, but it exists as a whole, not as the intersection of different lines. So this is why when people ask what's the relation between race and class, or they say, or they complain that my book didn't explain the relationship between race and class, because that is the question is wrong. To start out from the assumption that there is one thing called race and one thing called class, and then we could determine in the abstract how they're related, that would be a mistake. Rather, we have to take the actual object of analysis and generate concepts that allow us to understand its different features. So, you know, in the history of the United States, we have the history of different labor regimes, slavery, the wage labor, and so on. And that's a unitary phenomenon. That's not, it's not that first they decided to divide people into races, and then they decided to make them work in these different ways. No, there was a particular process of economic development which drew in migrant laborers from different places, Africa and Europe, and there was forced migration from Africa. There was a transformation in the kind of forced labor that people experienced. There was a categorization of different laborers based on their origin of migration. You know, that's all one process, and you can't say that there's a relationship between race and class in it. You use race and class as concepts to understand the different aspects of what happened. There's okay, sorry. The second aspect of the second thing I've drawn from Althusser is ideology, and I essentially equate identity with ideology. And you know, there are many ways to read the ideology essay and to think about what that might mean. For me, you know, the theory of ideology that's presented in Marxism and humanism earlier is also very important. It's very important to read that and to look at what he was already presenting there. So you know, it's easy to get into the formulas and the sort of slogans that are presented in the later essay and break that down. But there's a more general way of looking at it, which we could say that ideology is the way that we understand the things that happen to be the result of our will without understanding their actual causes. And so we form in our imaginations a way of understanding our social lives as the result of our wills, without knowing the real causes that are happening behind our backs, which are the effect of the social structure. And so identity, whether it's racial or not, it appears to us in our imaginations. And you know, this people may think that this is belittling our lived experience, etc., etc. Of course, the imagination is real. This is not to say that people are making a mistake. We will always have imaginary relations to our conditions of existence. And so we form in our imaginations the idea that something called race is a part of who we are. That my race is something that has to do with my essence, my physical characteristics, my biology, my ancestry, etc. But the reality is that there is history and there is a social structure which has produced my race as an effect. It is an impersonal system of social classification. It's not something that comes out of me and who I am. I was inserted into this category as a result of this social and historical process. So the sense in which identity is ideological is that at the imaginary level, I turn this impersonal social form into an attribute of myself. And this is one of the complications, is that it's natural for me to do that because my perceptual capacity as an individual is limited. I don't have an understanding of the whole history that put me where I am and that put me in the social classifications that I'm in. I don't just spontaneously understand that. And so this imaginary conception that I have is real in this sense, in the sense that it's part of that social structure. But it's not an adequate understanding of, it doesn't present us with a real knowledge of what race is. And so if we want to move from ideology to knowledge, we have to understand identity as an effect and as an imaginary relation. And then we can, I can circle back, then we can engage in the kind of analysis I was talking about earlier, which in which we can produce adequate concepts to understand it. Once we have criticized identity, then we can understand race.
Asad, still speaking about Althusser, here in Brazil, one of the most criticized concepts of him is the concept of epistemological break. So, if I'm not mistaken, you use this concept, and so what is this concept, and why do we use it? Why do you think it's important to use it?
Okay, the epistemological break is the way that we look, the way that we understand the introduction of a new method of analysis. Let's say in very plain terms. Now, it comes out of Althusser's analysis of the development of Marxist thought, and of course, this is where it causes all the controversy, because for many people, it's important to understand Marxist thought as essentially continuous with the youthful theory of alienation continuing into all of the late works. And so because people start with that dogmatic kind of commitment, and I just mean using dogmatic descriptively, they've just decided that this is the case, and so then they want to produce an interpretation consistent with that. So these people with that perspective will often criticize Althusser and say that, you know, no, look, this date is wrong because after 1845 he uses this term, or in 1857 he uses this term. You didn't identify how he changed over there, etc., etc. But that's the wrong way of understanding what an epistemological break is, because the epistemological break doesn't mean all of a sudden abandoned your old way of thinking and you come up with a completely new way of thinking. in some ways, it would be better if we started with the concept of the problematic than the epistemological break, in the sense that the problematic is the way of posing questions, the categories and presuppositions of a particular system of thought. And I appropriate this line of Althusser's at the beginning of my book, that we all have to be born somewhere. And this is where he uses it to point out we all begin in a particular problematic, and Marx did too. And Marx began to think within the problematic of the young Hegelians. And so he inherited many of their terms, many of their methods, and in some ways he modified them, introduced, new terms that he took from other things that he was reading, but he was working essentially within that problematic. Now, if you want to understand how a specific mode of thought called Marxism is constituted, you have to understand how he goes beyond that problematic and enters into a new one. And so this is a question that anybody interested in Marxism has to pose, because Marxism didn't already exist before Marx. So the other joke Althusser says is the skull of the child Voltaire. It had to be produced. This new way of thinking had to be produced, and that meant going beyond the existing problematic. So the epistemological break is just that moment at which at which the structure of the previous problematic is modified and a new structure of thought emerges. And this is a complicated moment, because the new approach, the new way of thinking, still has to be articulated in the language that is available. And so there can't be a sudden disappearance of all of the language that characterized the previous problematic. In fact, the new problematic will in many ways be expressed in the language of the old one. And so the epistemological break is going to be something which actually is prolonged and uneven, and there will be moments at which it appears that the old problematic has come back. There will be moments at which new terms are invented. And certainly in 1845, it's very clear that the old problematic is rejected and a new one is introduced, and new terms are introduced. Mode of production, replaces the term civil society. History is understood in terms of the relationship between the forces and relations of production. It's not understood as the alienation of species being. I mean, there's no way that you could say that in 1845 there wasn't this change. So that's quite clear. Now, you can argue that terms like alienation or elements of the Hegelian method and so on appear once again, especially starting with the Grundrisse. I think that, for one thing, that is not a refutation of Althusser's argument. It's in fact quite consistent, as I was saying, with Althusser's argument. But then also, we still have that problem, and Marx expresses it in the afterword to the second edition of Capital, in which he says that Hegel had a dialectic that he says he flirted with it. He says it was a great method, but he has a different dialectic. Marx has a different dialectic, and Hegel's dialectic glorifies the existing state of things, whereas Marx's dialectic, he says, is critical and revolutionary. Now, he doesn't present any methodological explanation of what these different dialectics are, and that's why we can't just say that we can apply Hegel's dialectical method to the material world or to the economy or something like that, because Marx says that the dialectic itself is different. But since he doesn't explain it, we have to elaborate it on his behalf, and this is what for Marx means. We have to do it for Marx since he didn't do it. And this is why the other book is called Reading Capital, because we have to read Capital in such a way that we can draw out the method that is being practiced there, but isn't separately explained.
Still speaking about problematic, I'm not sure if you remember, but when you came to Brazil, you said you were working in a problem of how to think about emancipation and the subject of emancipation without assuming a Feuerbachtian problematic. In other words, how to think about emancipation using a post-epistemological break problematic. So how do you think of that?
So this is in the problem that was posed that you were referring to was that I look at on the Jewish question and the analysis of emancipation there, but this belongs to the earlier problematic. So how do we, and after this, Marx talks about how the emancipation of the working class will be carried out by the working class itself. He makes various references to emancipation, but does not present, once again, a philosophical account. And so that's something else that it seems like we have to do for Marx. I have become interested, I think that after Althusser and the Althusserian critique of the subject, I certainly am very interested in Poulantzas and everybody else like that in terms of an analysis of society. But I think that it was the circle around Badiou that thought the most about how to produce a new theory of the subject. And so that's what I became interested in afterwards. And I especially was interested in, the person who was in Badiou's organization and really provided the political theory, Sylvain Lazarus, who presents a theory of political subjectivity, which is not a historicist one. That is, it's not one which is about a kind of teleology of emancipation. It's also not one which is based on, this is the sort of most provocative premise, that it's not based on any social foundation. And in fact, the very emancipatory character of the political subject lies in the fact that it does not rest on a social foundation. And this is a very great break with basic assumptions of Marxist thought, because there are many different versions of this. There is a Feuerbachian one, but there's also a later one, which understands the political subject as the expression of a particular social foundation. And the materialist version of this is to say that the working class, the proletariat, is at the very core of capitalist accumulation. It's at the center of the development of this mode of production. And so that will be the basis for a political subject that will overturn this system. And that's the reason why in the history of Marxism, class is understood as the fundamental category. I think that this is an important distinction. Class is central not because it is more material than other social relations. Materialism means that we understand the material basis of all social relations. If we were to say that race is just an idea, we would not be engaging in materialist analysis, for example. So the reason why class is central in Marxism is that based on this social analysis, the class subject was the subject of universal emancipation. That was determined by the laws of history. That's why class was fundamental. Now, we can say that that way of understanding the political subject enters into crisis. It enters into crisis with the Paris Commune, for example, in which there is not the production of these new forms of life, which Marx identifies as the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is not the result of the gathering together of proletarians in the factory, in which they form associations and then overturn the existing society, but rather it's the result of these various historical accidents of war, many different social groups coming together and forming new kinds of association. And then in the 20th century revolutions, the communist revolution takes place on the basis of peasant revolution, of national liberation. Once again, it can't be understood in terms of the expression of the social foundation of the industrial proletariat. Certainly the industrial proletariat is involved in the Russian Revolution. It's harder to make that case for the Chinese Revolution. But the important point is that this model in which historical laws determine the social foundation of the political subject, that enters into crisis. And so this theory is that we have to formulate the political subject, Lazarus says, in interiority, on its own terms, before we engage in social analysis. And so this is a very radical change, but it's one that is based on these earlier breakthroughs, because if we accepted the Feuerbachian view, then that's a view of a social foundation at the beginning of history, which realizes itself at the end of the historical process. So once we have criticized that, once we have criticized the various ideological subjects, then we can produce this new theory of the subject, which is one that says emancipatory politics has to be formulated before social analysis, and that then we have to understand how it relates to the social structure and to social categories. And this is a complicated question. I think, the person who has developed this is Michael Neocosmos, has produced some ideas about how to develop this problem, because it is once you've made this radical move of saying emancipatory politics has to be conceived first and in itself, then you have the complicated problem of how do you relate that then to the actual society in its concrete existence. And so that's what I was talking about earlier with in Althusser's understanding of the production of concepts that can understand complex structured whole. I mean, this is the great problem for me that I've arrived at.
Not wanting to take much more of your time, but since you were talking about all of these problems that we are able to think through Althusser and all of his students and everyone who came after him, there is also another point that is very criticized, and it's a complicated point, which is the critique to humanism. Mm-hmm. So from that, I'll draw the question, how could we think about forming a struggle against racism, since we're focusing on that because of your book, without thinking about it through the humanist perspective? How could we think about that struggle outside of it?
So one thing is, first, the preliminary aspect of this is that theoretical anti-humanism is a specific thing, which is, it belongs to the problematic of the young Marx. It's not just an idea about human nature, but it's a theory of history. And, we have to criticize that theory of history actually in order to have any space for political action. This is the funny thing, that people think that Althusser eliminated human agency from history. But the reality is that if you have a teleological understanding of history in which everything is determined by historical laws, whether they are related to the unfolding of species being or to the development of the mode of production or of the transhistorical development of the productive forces, either way, you haven't left room for action. So it's actually only when you criticize these teleological conceptions of history that you understand that it's possible to transform the world. It's possible to engage in action that transforms the world. Now, who does that? What is the subject that does that? Is it the human? Well, Althusser says in the reply to John Lewis, in a way that's sort of it's sort of brutal, but he says, you could say that man makes history, but Marxism says the masses make history. Now, this could be a dogmatic kind of response, but the point is very important, that human doesn't describe, to refer to humans, you're not describing the actual concrete forces that are engaging in political action. The masses refers not just to individual human beings, but to the majority of society who are subjected to capitalist domination, and who will be the basis of self-governance in a different kind of society. You can't just reduce that to the human, because it's based on a completely different understanding of collective groups of people. Now, the second aspect of this is that the masses make history insofar as they are organized. That is, there is only political action which is organized, and this used to be the automatic kind of thing you fill in there is the party. That used to be the automatic answer. Now, I don't think that we can automatically say it is something like the old model of the party, which is the form of organization. But if you are just thinking in terms of human beings, you're not posing the question of organization. It's not people as humans, as individuals who change the world, but masses that are organized in a particular way. And so this is the advantage of moving beyond humanism, because if you stick with humanism, then you bring everything back to the kind of individual action of a human being and the individual experience of a human being, rather than conceiving in terms of collectivities of people that are organized in concrete ways. Now, there is a second point, which I've forgotten, but so we'll go back to you. Yeah. I remember now. Okay. There is nevertheless a problem here, which is that the idea of universal emancipation means the emancipation of all of humanity. And, theoretical anti-humanism doesn't mean that we don't care about individual human beings. We don't care about people. And in fact, this is a great problem with the debate around identity politics, because some people want to assert a universal human foundation as the alternative to identity politics. They say identity politics is too much about difference, but actually we're all human in the end, and so this is what we have in common, and that's the basis for a universal politics. And I think this is a mistaken way of proceeding. This humanist way of proceeding is mistaken, because actually, you know, the reality is that we are all completely different. You know, we may be human beings, but we have different experiences. We have all these different characteristics. We have different immediate interests. That's a basic fact of human existence. So our human existence, that can't be, our human existence as it already takes place, can't be the foundation of a universal politics. It's only when we go beyond our immediate existence and generate the possibility of a politics which is for everyone that we can speak of a universal human. So I think that one consequence of the critique of humanism is that the category of the human comes back as the result of a political process and not as the foundation of one. And so we can't answer identity politics by saying, well, we're all humans, so we're all the same, so you know, we can't get distracted by differences. That, I think, is not an effective response. The response is to say that we are fundamentally constituted by difference, but that through political action, we can generate a society which is for everyone, for the interest of everyone, rather than for just some. And at that point, the category of the human represents everyone. It doesn't represent a particular kind of nature or a particular experience. It just represents the fact that this is a politics of everyone and not a politics of some. And in that sense, I think the human comes back, just meaning everyone.
So Asad, I want to thank you very much for your time. Before we finish, do you want to use this space to promote something? A new book, some article, something like that?
It'll be a little while before I have another book, but everyone should check out Viewpoint, viewpointmag.com. My most recent article was this one, confusingly, the magazine is called The Point. So Viewpoint and The Point, that's where you can find my latest article.
So thank you very much, Asad. I think the interview was wonderful. And thank you in the name of our group, Gepal, and thank you for all who watched us.
Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.